This is Michel Sorbet, and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I'd like to show you a game which I have already showed you on Wojennik TV during a previous unboxing, but today I'd like to show you the review of this title. This will be a presentation of Victory World War II, a title released in 2019 by Columbia Games. This is not a 100% new game because it was actually released for the first time in 1998, and this will be the presentation of the second edition, which was successfully funded and published due to a Kickstarter campaign. This Kickstarter campaign had for its objective to gather $10,000, and it was closed with $25,000, so it was quite a successful campaign. This is mainly a two-players game in which both players will take control of armies consisted of units from World War II, so both air as well as naval and ground forces, trying to overcome their foes and secure victory objectives set by the scenario. The game is called Victory World War II, but in fact you won't be fighting any real campaign from World War II. You won't be retracing the paths of any famous units. You will be fighting on geomorphic maps on abstract terrain. The units, however, which will be used in the game come from World War II, so you will find paratrooper units, standard infantry units, even cavalry units, some additional units added during the Kickstarter campaign as stretch goals, also some naval and air units which come from World War II. The game was designed by Tom Dalglish and Grant Dalglish. As I said earlier, it's primarily for two players, but if you have more copies of the game, or you decide to, for instance, play in a group of more players during the game, each player will, for instance, take control of one of the forces, the aerial forces, the naval forces, or the ground forces. It's absolutely also possible to play it in a group of more than two people. The time of play will depend on the scenario chosen, on the way of playing, because if one of the players is highly aggressive, the game can last shorter, but in general plays will take you from 2.5 to even 5 hours. Today I'd like to show you this game once more, to tell you a little bit about the mechanics used in this game, and at the end I'd like to give you, as always, my final thoughts, and I'd like to tell you what I think are the strong but also the weaker points of this title. So let's begin. Here is the second edition of Victory World War II. I'd like now to show you how the elements of this game look, then how the game works. So the first and major element which we will be using during plays of Victory will be the blocks, because as it is in the case of most of Columbia Games titles, this is a block war game, and we receive really a huge quantity of those blocks, which will come in two different colors, the red ones and the blue ones. Now those two armies are totally symmetrical, so you will receive the same quantity and the same types of units, but you receive really a great variety of units, and each time you will be using different armies. Each time you will be able to construct different armies, both depending on your style of play, on your preferences, and also on the maps that you will be using and on the battleground. Those units are divided into three major types, into air units, naval units and ground units, and during each of those types we have several subtypes. So for instance, in naval units we will have battleships, we'll have submarines, we'll have cruisers, we'll have carriers. In the ground units we will have standard infantry, we will have engineers, paratroopers, mountain infantry, a lot of tank types, artillery, etc. So there is a great variety of those units. We even receive some special units which were added to the game as additional Kickstarter stretch goals, and those were, for instance, rockets or even A-bombs. So it is also possible to use those weapons in this game. Now, those blocks will be used during the game, and what is an important element of Victory is that when playing the game, you will be constructing new units, you will be upgrading those which were already present on the board at the moment of the start of the production phase. And at the same time, even if you happen to lose a unit during the game, you will still be able to reconstruct it and to bring it back into play. Those units and those blocks have almost everything that you will be needing to play on those stickers. Because as you can see, you have firstly depiction of the unit. Sometimes it will be a symbol, sometimes it will be a silhouette of the ship or of the aircraft, but at the same time you have also an abbreviation telling you, for instance, that this is a dive bomber or that this is a torpedo bomber. So those information are also included. Now those units have, as you can see, different letters printed on the upper left side, upper left corner of the block, and this is the combat turn, which indicates when such a unit will attack during combat. If such a unit has a combat result, a combat factor close to A, it will attack earlier than units which have a letter which is farther from A. So jet fighters will always attack first. They have an A plus combat turn, whereas for instance infantry have an E combat factor, which at most times will be the last letter which will be resolved during a combat. Apart from this information, we have also several others. We have the number of steps. Each such a unit can have up to 4 steps, which indicate the strength of the unit. If such a unit takes a loss when it had only 1 step, it is eliminated. You will be able to rebuild it, but at the moment it receives this hit, it is removed from the game. So when a unit takes a hit, you just rotate the block. This is one of the biggest advantages of block games. Not only granting you fog of war, this is obvious, but also tracking the strength of your unit. In hex and counter games, to indicate step losses or the current strength of units, you will have to flip your counter, or you will have to indicate that the unit has taken some losses, for instance adding additional counters, which increases the number of counters placed on the board. Here it's extremely simple. You rotate the block. If you happen to rebuild a strength point, you just reflip it and you can regain your strength. Additionally, we have the movement factor telling us how many hexes normally such a unit can move. Finally, we have also the cost of putting such a unit into play. This is the cost, but the cost per step. So if you want to build, for instance, an infantry unit consisting of 4 steps, you will have to spend 4 production points. If you want to rebuild only 1 step of a 3-step unit, you will have to pay 1 production point. Finally, we have the firepower of such units, which can vary depending on the target of the attack. The first digit is for attacks against aircraft, the second one against naval units, and the third against ground units. And those levels vary from unit to unit. For instance, cavalry units can attack only ground units because, as you can see, they have zeros when it comes to air or naval firepower. I said that those blocks have almost everything on them. There are some additional rules governing some units which aren't printed on the block, and we have to keep them in mind. So, for instance, we have paratroop units who can paradrop, so make a special kind of move. Additionally, we have special rules governing supplying paratroop units. We have carrier units which have a certain capacity, meaning that you can stock only a certain number of air steps on such units. We have the A-bomb, we have rockets, we have also even special rules governing infantry, because if defending a city, their firepower is increase to 3 when fighting ground units. So even though we have the majority of those information printed on those labels, we still have some overrules which we have inside the rule book, which we should keep in mind when playing. The second kind of element that we will be using are the maps. We receive 4 maps inside this base edition. Those maps, as you can see, are geomorphic maps, which means that you can assign them in the way that you like, and you will always have a legal battlefield. So you can connect them using all sides, and you can obtain each time a very different battlefield. As you can see, a lot of things is going on those maps. We have maps with more or less land, with more or less water. We have some marshes, we have some woods, we have some mountain. On those maps we have some roads, which will be important not only for movement but also for supply purposes. And finally, we have also cities and towns. Towns are the smaller ones without any numbers, whereas those where the numbers are present are called cities. Cities, as you can see, have some digits which can vary from 1 to even 4. We don't have any 4s in the base game, but I believe that we do have some on additional maps which come in the expansions. And on each map you have a sum of 10 points. Now, those points are used for 2 things. The first is to product, because those are points which are equal to production points. So for instance, this city will give you 3 production points during each turn that you will be able to spend in order to place new units or upgrade units present in such a city. Secondly, this digit indicates also the number of victory points that such a city grants to its controller. In general, to win a game, you should control a certain number of cities, giving you a certain number of victory points at the time we resolve the victory point step during a turn. In the base game, in the starting game, we will be using 2 maps, a certain number of blocks which will be randomly chosen at the game start, and the objective of the game will be to control 15 or more victory points at the end of the victory phase. So if we have 10 points on each map, and if we control such a map at the game start, our objective will be in general to occupy cities which have a value of 5 points or more. If we manage to do so, defending our own cities, we can win the game. We receive also additional elements which are counters used in advanced rules. We receive, for instance, factory counters which can be placed inside cities in order to additionally enhance the economical layer of this game, because normally in the base game we can construct units of all the 3 types in wherever we want, with the sole exception that naval units can be constructed only in ports. But apart from that, we can construct them wherever we want, where we have those production centers. If using those counters, we will be placing factories, meaning that, for instance, here we'll be able to place an air unit. If we do not have an air factory, we cannot place an air unit on such a city. Those factories can be changed, can be upgraded, because we can increase their production capacity. So this is an interesting addition for advanced players. We receive additional counters such as mulberries, such as airfields, because it is also possible to play with additional airfields placed on the map. Finally, we receive also an interesting token. This is the storm token, which is placed always at the game start at the middle of the playing area, and then during each turn this storm will be moved depending on die rolls, and it can pin units which are inside such a storm or around it, because the storm will be blocking movement through such hexes. It can even inflict step losses if units travel through the storm when it is present on such spaces. Now, how the game begins and how the game works. In general, the first thing that you will do is to choose a scenario. You have several ones, both in the rulebook as on the Columbia Games page. You can also create your own, because this game really cries for this. You can use your imagination, and you can firstly create the battlefield as you like using those maps. Finally, you can also create the army according to your own needs. Now, there is an interesting mode in which you do not receive a number of units which is indicated in the rules, but you receive a certain amount of production points. And based on this production, on this number of production points, you can build your army just like in a miniatures game, using those production points and placing units on the map. So you can, for instance, focus on a highly developed aircraft army, or you can decide to create a big naval force, or you can go for a mix. It depends on your style of play, on the maps chosen, and on the objectives which are to achieve during the scenario. I like it a lot because it is somewhat of a crossover between a war game and a miniatures game, and it allows you to create your own battlefield, create your own army. But even if you decide to create such an army, it doesn't mean that you'll have to stick to this army up to the game's end, because during the game you still will be able to build new units, and this is also one big thing that is, in my opinion, the biggest advantage of this game, but I will be speaking about it in a few moments. So after choosing the scenario, for instance, you can go for a scenario in which each player receives 20 random blocks, and we use 2 random maps. We will place those blocks on the map, of course, in such a way that our opponent doesn't know what we have on such a block, because this is the main purpose of using blocks, to obtain fog of war, and we can begin the game. Now, the game is played in a series of turns, during which you will be relying on a sequence of play. Firstly, you will determine initiative during each turn. Initiative is resolved extremely simply. You just roll 2 dice, you compare the results, and the highest roller is the player who will start moving his units. In case of a tie, you just re-roll the dice. Movement consists in moving your units across the map using their movement factors. There is also a possibility of using strategical movement. When it comes to ground units, you will be using roads in order to use strategical movement. Other units can move using a bigger number of points than they could usually use. An interesting mechanic is that in this game we have not only a stacking limit concerning the maximum number of units which can be present on a hex, we have also a hex side limit. Now, the stacking limit is pretty obvious. This is the maximum number of blocks that you can have on a given type of terrain. But the hex side limit tells you how many units can cross a hex side between 2 hexes. Now, this is an additional complication, an additional thing to take into consideration when playing, because if I have, for instance, a force consisting of 4 units, and I want to attack 2 units on a hex which is next to mine. In most war games, I'd just push those units and I would initiate a battle, but not in victory, because here you have to take into consideration the hex side limit. The hex side limit for clear terrain is 2 blocks, which means that you can move only 2 blocks through this hex side. If I want to add additional blocks, I will have to move through a different hex side, which in this case is possible. But if my opponent had a block here, it wouldn't be possible, because I could place only those blocks here and 1 additional here. Why only 1? Well, because in this game we have also the pinning mechanics, which tells you that if there is a block of your opponent on a hex, you cannot move the same amount of blocks from this hex. So if we have only one block each, neither player can move any of those blocks. If, for instance, red player had 2 blocks, he can move one of them from this hex. The second one will remain pinned. So the hex side limit is an interesting addition. I think that we already had in some other Columbia Games titles. A nice addition because it adds an additional tactical layer to the game, and in my opinion it's also a nice way to simulate some logistical difficulties, some logistical aspects that we have to take into consideration when planning offensives, planning movement, etc. So after moving the units, after the first player removed his units, it's up to the second player to move his units. He can also initiate battles entering hexes where enemy units are present. He can also reinforce places where battles were already initiated, but in such a case, those units joining the battle will take part in the battle only from the second round of such a combat. After all players have moved their units, we pass to the combat phase. Combat is resolved extremely simply because we unveil the units which are part of the battle without returning the units which reinforced the battle, and we look at the letters on the upper left corner, searching for the order in which those units will begin their attack. So, for instance, here the 2 armor units will strike before the defender's infantry. But the defender's infantry will strike before the attacker's infantry because the defender has the upper hand. It can attack first. How an attack is resolved? We check the number of steps of an attacking unit, which tells us how many dice we will be rolling, and in order to inflict hits, we have to obtain a number equal or lower than the number printed on the block. If we attack aircraft, that would be 1. We cannot attack naval units with armor, but we can attack ground units, and we will have to roll 2 or 1 in order to score a hit. When attacking, we always have to declare against what type of units we are attacking. We cannot attack a precise unit. We have to indicate the type of unit. So, for instance, ground units. So after rolling those dice, we apply hits. Here there would be none, but if I had, for instance, a 2, I would inflict 1 hit. Now, if there is a defending unit of the attack type which has more step points than the others, I would reduce this unit in first order. If there is a tie, it's the defending player who decides which unit to decrease. Then the next letter would proceed in the same way in order to launch his own attacks. After the first round, if there is a second round, because it can occur that there won't be any second round, the additional blocks which reinforced come into the battlefield and they are added to the resolution order, to the unit's resolution order. During each round, units can attack, can retreat, or can pass. If the battle ends after 3 rounds and there are still units from both sides on the hex, the attacker has to retreat. If he manages to destroy all the opposing blocks, he takes control of the attack's hex. He takes also control of such a hex if there is no defending infantry. Instantly, the attacker takes control of such a hex. Each battle is resolved in such a way. First the attacks initiated by the first player, then by the second player. After this phase, we have the supply and victory check, during which we check the number of victory points of both players. If any of them has achieved victory, the game immediately stops. We verify supply, because each unit, apart from naval units, has to be supplied. A unit is supplied if it can trace a connection between its hex or an adjacent hex comprising a road up to a city. So in order to be in supply, we have to keep in mind that we cannot
leave the proximity of the roads for too long, because being out of supply will cause us to lose steps. Finally, we have the production phase, during which we will count the number of production points granted by cities, and we can place new units, or we can increase the steps of units which are present at those production points. And this is pretty it when it comes to the basic mechanics of Victory World War II. There are some other optional rules, there are some other detailed rules governing, for instance, using paratroopers, using A-bombs or amphibious assaults, but I won't be explaining them right now. I'd rather prefer to tell you now what I think about this game after playing it several times, what I believe are its strong but also a little weaker points.
Victory World War II is a game which was first published in 1998, so before it was re-released by Columbia Games, more than 20 years passed. This game was, when released, the first game using the new combat resolution system imposed by Columbia Games, and from that time it is still used in new Columbia Games titles, which means that this combat system is quite interesting and it is quite versatile. When looking at this game, I had a feeling that I am playing a game not about World War II, but a quite abstract game using forces from World War II. And this was the concept from the beginning. I'll tell you more about it in the second part of this conclusion, but first I'd like to tell you what I really like in this game, what I think are its strong points. The first one, in my opinion, is the fact that this is a very accessible game. This is a very easy to learn, very easy to teach game, at the same time very intuitive and with very functional components. It is a game in which you will be using the blocks, the map, and that's pretty it, because for people who are used to playing war games, they are used to using a lot of additional components, including a lot of player aids, with tons of tables, with combat resolution tables, with terrain effect charts, with morale tables, with bombardment tables, with a lot of die roll modifiers. Here it's totally absent from the game, which makes it very simple, but not overly simplified. It's a game in which you will still find a lot of interesting elements, in which you will find still a lot of chrome, but which are presented in such a way that they are extremely easy to use and to implement when playing. The strongest part of this system are the blocks, and they are absolutely terrific because firstly you have almost everything that you need to play on those stickers. The sole and only table which you will be using alongside the map and the blocks will be the terrain effects chart, which is a small table with the list of terrains, with the information about the stacking limit and the hex side limit. That's it. You won't be using anything else. Everything apart that is on the blocks. On the blocks you'll find the type of the unit, the number of steps, so the current strength of such a unit. You will find the production points needed to place an additional step or to place such a unit on the map. You'll find the movement factor. You will find the information about its strength against aerial units, against naval units, and about ground units. All is on one sticker presented right in front of you. Again, you also have the fog of war element thanks to those blocks, because those blocks placed upright are invisible to your opponent, and at the end finally you also have the possibility to track losses or damage to those units. So this is absolutely fantastic, both in terms of ergonomy as also in terms of playability. It's a great design, and also what deserves to be mentioned is that thanks to the fact that you have the information about the strength of those units against different types of units, you are not using any additional charts, which would tell you, for instance, that torpedo bombers cannot attack ground units. It's not aerial units. It's not there. It's not on a chart because you already have it on a sticker, and it's clever. It's intelligent. At the same time, differentiating those parameters, saying, for instance, that against naval units it has a strength of 3, but against ground units it has a strength of 1, instantly tells you how efficient such a unit is when used against a different type of unit. It's very clever, it's very intelligent, and it enables to simulate the utility of different units against some others in a very simple way. I like it a lot. The rulebook is it's not complex, it's not very long, it has a lot of information. That's true, because we still have some additional rules which you will have to memorize, which you will have to learn in order to properly play. What I like in this game is the fact that you do not have a lot of special cases, special rules which add a lot of chrome, but at the same time you still have some interesting mechanics which make this game different from others. And among some of them, the one that I like the most is the rule governing the hex side limit. Now, this is something that was already present in other Columbia games, but in this one it is still something that keeps me striking, because it is one of the few games which have this rule and which, again, in a very clever way, try to simulate some logistical problems in using the same path of approach by several units. In many games, in most war games, we have rules governing only terrain cost when moving onto such a terrain, and sometimes when passing through some hex sites, for instance streams, bocage, or other types of hex sites. But at most times you will be only paying additional movement points in order to cross such hexes or to enter such hexes. Here it's different, because you have a certain hex side limit which tells you how many units can pass through a hex site during one movement phase. And this is brilliant, because it is such a simple way to simulate how sometimes it is difficult to make many troops pass through the same path during a certain period of time. You can imagine one and only one road passing through a forest. How many units can pass through such a road during, say, 2 hours? You will not be using different paths or 5 roads. You will have to use the same road, which is, for instance, 3 meters large. Well, it's not the same as passing through a clear terrain when you can pass with masses of troops without any problem. And in my opinion, this is extremely clever. It's really brilliant to include this rule into the system. At the same time, it is a small trap for wargamers, because wargamers, as I said earlier, are used to the classical system. You have a certain amount of movement points and you can enter a hex respecting the stacking limit, no problem. But again, this hex side limit will sometimes cause you to make decisions which then will require you to find alternative solutions. You will have to take different paths of approach. Sometimes you'll have to rethink your attack plans because of those limits. And I like it, because thanks to it, this game is not that easy that it seems to be at first glance. What I really also like is the fact that apart from the blocks, the maps are extremely functional. They are not pretty at all. but they are extremely functional, and all the information that you need are on them. They are well presented, and I like it a lot. The small thing that which annoyed me a little bit is the fact that when you have a lot of blocks on a hex, you do not see if this is a city, if this is a producing hex. You have to remember it, because maybe it would be a better idea to place those information about those special hexes which are production sites on the hex sites, or maybe placing those information at the border of those hexes. Then even when placing blocks inside those hexes, that would be visible. But it's not a big issue, because you still have only a few of those spots on each map. What I also like in this system, and what I find is one of the strongest points of Victory, is the fact that it has an extremely large and a huge replay value. It's a game which you will be playing by 2 players, which will be playing using 3 or 4 players if using multiple copies or over maps. A game in which you can create your own scenarios without any problem. You have 4 maps which you can place in the way that you want. Additionally, if you use the maps from the expansions, which I also be presenting on my channel in some time, you can have an enormous diversity, an enormous variety of different map configurations. You can play 2 map battles, you can play 4 map battles, 3 map battles, even 6 if you want, but those will be really huge battles. The second thing is that you have really a great variety of possible scenarios, because you can randomly choose your blocks. You can play defensive battles. You can play constructing your battles from your armies from scratch, where you will be playing like in a miniatures game. You'll have a certain amount of production points, and you will be creating your own army from zero. I like it a lot, because it is also a game in which you will not only command your troops on the battlefield. Most war games focus on the battle, on the moment when you have already a certain amount of limited assets, which are predetermined by the game system, by the scenario, and that's it. You have to make the best of what you have. Here in Victory, you can create your own armies. Even if you start with a certain amount of units which are the same each time, if you play such a scenario, still during the game you'll have access to the full variety of the other units, and it's up to you to construct your own army. It's up to you to choose if you want to reinforce your air forces, if you want to reinforce your naval units, or if you want to focus on your infantry. It's up to you, and it's up to your decisions, it's up to your planning, where to put your factories, where to place your units, where to reinforce existing units in order to augment their strength. It's only up to your strategy, and I like it in Victory a lot, because, as I said, it's a game in which you'll be not only using your assets in battle, you'll be also planning what assets to place onto the battlefield. So this is a game in which this element of planning will be almost as important, or even maybe sometimes more important, than using those units in the most efficient way. What I like less in this game is, first, its very abstract approach to World War II, because it is supposed to be a game set in World War II or using elements from World War II, but which has the name World War II in its name, but in fact it doesn't simulate World War II. It's very abstract. I understand the idea, I understand why it is such it is, but it is too abstract in my opinion. Still, players who look for games covering World War II will find this game too abstract to fully enjoy it. In World War II games, you have a certain theme, you can have a certain feeling of the battle. Here it's more difficult to grasp, it's more difficult to feel it, because you have some geographic names which make you think of some parts of our globe on the maps. but still those maps are not very pretty, and when looking at the coastline, when looking at those cities, you do not think of absolutely any part of our globe. Personally, when looking at those maps, I have no association at all with any parts of Europe or other parts of the world where the war was fought. And this connection between the setting and the components and the play can be problematic for some players. The second thing is that both sides are totally symmetrical, and this is both a positive aspect as also a negative one, because the positive one is, as I said earlier, it's up to you to construct your own army with all this great variety of units. The negative one is you will be always seeing the same units, and you will not be having this feeling that you have still a special asset, a special edge that you can use against your opponent. Even the nukes, which are special units unlocked during the Kickstarter campaign, are available for both sides. Maybe some additional tweaks would be welcomed. In the expansions which you receive, those armies are asymmetrical. So this is a solution. If you're looking for additional elements which will increase the variety and at the same time differentiate both armies, you should definitely pick the expansions, which I also will be showing in some time. The third element is that this game is quite long to play. I said it is quite easy to play, it's true, but at the same time the fact that those sides are pretty even at the game's start makes this game quite long, because it will really take some time before you manage to push the enemy behind, before your strategy proves to be more efficient and victorious and winning. So taking those cities, taking those points, those victory points, can take you really a lot of time. This is not a problem, but this is a thing which may bother people who do not play war games a lot, who discover this game as their first war game. Maybe in such situation it would be a good idea to play some smaller scale scenarios in order to avoid those games to be too long. Having said that, I believe that Victory Second World War II, the second edition, is an interesting design. It is still, after more than 20 years from its initial release, a very interesting title, a title which has an enormous replay value, which enables you to construct your own army, to tailor it to your own needs and to your own strategy, which enables you to adapt also to the playing area, the maps which will change from game to game. A very functional, very accessible war game, very abstract war game in which you will not feel this climate of an epic struggle fought in World War II, but sufficiently interesting, with a lot of interesting and easy mechanism at the same time, that you should have fun playing this game. This was the review of Victory World War II, the second edition, from Columbia Games. Thank you a lot for watching this review. I invite you to take a look at our other videos, both our unboxings and reviews in English. Take also a look at our Facebook and Instagram accounts. If you want to support Wojennik TV, you can take a look at our Patronite account. Have a terrific day and see you next time.